The message doesn't change, the messenger does. Joseph Smith took what he knew his followers already understood because many of them were already Masons, and now he was too. And
Yeah.
I've heard modern Freemasons make the assertion that this was some sort of ritual from antiquity dating back to the actual building of Solomon's temple.
hmm
Um, no reputable historian, Masonic or otherwise, would acknowledge that to be the case. There
Mormonism
is,
with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hi everyone, I just want to say at the start of this video, unfortunately for this interview, I didn't adjust the Zoom settings because this was the first interview I've done of 2025. And unfortunately, every time we talk, the camera flicks from my screen to his screen. And also the audio isn't the best coming from Greg. So apologies for that, but hopefully you can still enjoy the episode. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. So we're continuing the series we've been doing, looking at Masonry and the Temple Endowment. And I have joining me today Larry Saint and also a Mason, Greg Kearney. Greg, thanks for joining me today.
thank you.
Yeah, it's a privilege to have you. So you're both a Latter-day Saint and a Freemason. You have been on Fair. You gave a presentation about 20 years ago, and you've done a lot of research on this topic. And I've been doing my own series on the Temple Endowment and some of the similarities and connections to Freemasonry. I've been looking at things which are similar between both ceremonies, some of the differences. I've been exploring any correspondences or similarities to ancient rituals, things in antiquity, and I've interviewed people like Jeff Bradshaw. I had on Jasmine Rapley, and I had recently church historian Steve Harper to go over maybe some apologetic responses to it as well. But I wanted to bring you on. You were recommended to me from Scott Gordon, and I've listened to some of the things you've had to say. But maybe before we talk about Masonry and the Temple Endowment, some of my listeners may not be familiar with yourself. So, would you mind providing maybe a little bit of background about who you are, maybe your life in the church, maybe your engagement with apologetics and fair, and then we'll jump into the Temple Endowment and Masonry after that.
Um, I'm Greg Kearney. I grew up in the U.S. state of Maine, um, to a family that had a long history in the restoration on both sides of that divide, as it were. Um, and I also come from a long line of Freemasons that date back well before the establishment of the church. My the ancestral trade of my family, the Kearney family, were that of practicing stonemasons and quarrymen. Um, but my father was the first generation of Kearneys not to follow that in that trade, which is pretty rare to these days. Um, and let's see, what else? I am a BYU graduate. I am perhaps best known among my BYU cohort or outside of my association with FAIR and with this topic of Freemasonry and the church. And the temple endowment is that I am a syndicated editorial cartoonist.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, the topic for another day, perhaps. I came out of the same cohort as Pat Bagley and Stephen Benson and Calvin Grundall at BYU. So I was kind of the last one they trusted to emit
Sort of
from
artistic
the,
pursuits on the side, and you also like diving into academic stuff and research.
yeah,
But when you're
yeah.
not doing that,
Yeah, well,
creativity and art.
I have a design degree originally. That's what my
Okay, very good.
training is,
So what?
because nobody really wants an American studies kind of guy who, what am I going to do with that?
And I think you'll have an interesting perspective because you're also a Mason as well. So, I've read a book on Masonry and I've done some research and listened to podcasts on it, but we're kind of getting from the horse's mouth. I did interview another member of the church, Hayden Carroll, who's also a Mason. But maybe we could begin with, could you just talk briefly about what Freemasonry is, when it originated, and then the influence that Freemasonry had on the Temple Endowment?
Okay. Freemasonry is the world's oldest and largest fraternal organization. Um, it has its earliest origins in the early Middle Ages in England, particularly around the city of York. Um,
Which is a nice
it,
city,
yeah,
quite a historic city.
which is, and it was essentially a trade union at that time. It was an organization of practicing stonemasons, builders of the great cathedrals, um, and uh, the the trade essentially the trade secrets that went into building a cathedral. And so, how were they to determine that a person was properly trained and should be allowed to into the quarries and into the stone cutting yards and the lodge in the stone lodges of these construction sites? Was they created essentially a system of identifying the level of training a person had, starting with an apprentice, and then a fellow craft mason, or eventually a master mason. Um, it is important to note that those are the 3 degrees of masonry. We hear a lot about all these supplemental degrees. Those are all products of the 19th century, or late 18th and early 19th century. They don't have their origins in antiquity or any, well, when I say antiquity, I'm meaning, Middle Ages up to the point where masonry made the shift from operative masons, people building cathedrals and buildings and things of
Hmm.
that nature, and into what is referred to as speculative masonry, where we take the lessons of the operative masons and apply speculative or moralistic lessons to those. Um, that really began in the 1700s with the United Grand Lodge of England.
Right. So that was the first Grand Lodge. It was in the 1700s, but you're saying before then, in
Before then, it
medieval
was
Europe.
they existed, and maybe some of the operative lodges took in non-operative men as speculative masons, but it was pretty much, and they devised a whole series of tests that involved grips and words that they would use to test. So because people didn't carry around union cards, in the Middle Ages, a man presenting himself as a mason of would be tested by being asked to produce grips, words, other indications that would give the masters of the lodge a means to know, is this an apprentice? Is this a fellow craft mason? Who should be working in the quarries? Is he a master mason like ourselves?
Hmm.
Because, he could walk and say, I'm a master mason, and they'd have no way to check other than these keywords and signs and tokens that he was going to give them to indicate uh, whether he was. So Masonry begins in the Middle Ages as a trade guild, and continues until the early 1700s, when we start to see what's called speculative masonry, which is taking all these trade guild attributes and um, and using them to teach a moralistic business. This was right at the high point of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment of those. So those ideas crept into it. Um, a couple of things that Masonry is not. It is not a religion. It never claimed to be one. It
Hmm.
offers no means of salvation. which is the kind of the basic test of a religion.
Right.
It in at least in Anglo-American Freemasonry accepts people of all religious faiths, provided they can affirm some belief in some sort of supreme being, something other than themselves.
Right. And as
So,
you said, it's more of a fraternal organization. Traditionally, it was men that
yeah,
would be part of it.
traditionally, yeah, there is this idea of co-masonry, which admitted women. It appeared in post-revolutionary France. Um, Never really got much of a following in the Anglo-American tradition, although there are some co-Masonic lodges that do exist in both England and America and Canada and
Hmm.
Australia has some, but that's very rare.
Right. And I think this wasn't one of the questions I had, but there's a lot of secrecy attached to masonry. Some have seen it as, oh, is it this conspiracy, this secret
Yeah, no,
organization? Some have
we're
even
not
associated
trying to take over the,
with
we're
the
not trying to
occult,
take over the
even.
world. We're not, grand directors of something. First of all, if it's a secret, it's a terribly poorly kept one. Um, any good library, and in fact, if you went to any large Masonic lodge or the Grand Lodge in England or any of the Grand Lodges in the United States, they have extensive libraries that are open to the public. It has been well documented by Masonic authors, not even people trying to expose anything. What it does do is it teaches, in some ways, like the Temple Endowment, it teaches circumspection, that you don't cast pearls before swine, essentially. It's not that we don't talk about the pearls, but we are circumspect in that. The secrecy, such that it has existed and came up through the Masonic tradition, had, of course, its origins in trying to protect the trade secrets of practicing stonemasons. If they all got out and everybody knew what to tell the masters of these lodges building cathedrals were, it would, undermine the whole system that was being developed. So, and now it is a tradition that we are circumspect, that we don't go around. And this is one thing that always drives me crazy is you see these pictures of, oh, so and so, look at them, they're giving the secret grip of Freemasons. Um, that particular little chestnut has gone around a lot in anti-Mormon circles. When they take a photograph of President Nelson or President um, Hinckley shaking hands with some, world leader, president, and,
Hmm.
you know, the Pope and whoever. And as you see, that's one of the secret grips of a Mason. It isn't. We
Um,
don't give those grips outside the lodge. We don't go running around to places where there
just
are
something
press
you do,
photographers.
just something you do in your lodges when you
Yeah,
meet fellow
it's an
masons.
indicate. It's used in a particular spot in the in the ritual. It is not something that you just go around doing.
Am I right in thinking that?
Even if you know they're Masons, you don't do that.
Right. Am I right in thinking that masonry as well? It's promoting brotherhood and unity amongst your fellow Freemasons, and you're also making oaths or promises of like moral values, and also you're trying to do good in the community.
Yeah, and you take everything that you're taking an oath of is to help your fellow Mason, to help his widows and orphans, which was, we don't think of it much today, but at the time that this was coming up, a widow, unless she came from very well-off background, was in real trouble,
Mm,
real financial distress. or an
And I know you
orphan.
said that it's not religious, but it made me think of the scripture. I think is it in
It's
James about
more,
true religion is to minister to
yeah,
help the sick and the widows and the orphans. So it's important acts of service that you're doing.
yeah. In this country, the Masons sponsor a whole host of children's hospitals. Yeah, well, we have other charities, too, orphanages and things of that nature, but we're best known for the Shriners Children's Hospitals, which are specialized pediatric hospitals for burns and orthopedic injuries and things like that. And their distinctive trait is they have no means to collect money at the hospital.
Right.
But you're just it's pure, yeah, the Shriners put a bite on me every year to contribute, but to me, it's not. They don't go around asking for money from those whom they are treating. So it's a these are Masonic charities. We have homes for the aged and stuff, things of that nature.
And when did you become a Freemason, and what motivated or inspired you to want to become a Freemason? I think you said that your family history were all Masons as well. So was that why
Yeah,
you
with
became
that
Mason?
was it. It was the fact that there's like you know you know probably 10 generations of Masons. I have quite a collection of the documentation. Great for doing genealogy if you can get hitched into a Masonic family because you can just run the tree back. This practically as far as written records exist in English speaking world. So yeah, so that was the primary. I became a Mason as a young adult.
Okay. Now we are going to transition here in a second to talking about the temple endowment, but I want to ask you maybe a personal question. What I guess what benefit or what blessings do you feel have come from you being a Mason as well? Like how's it helped you in your life?
Anybody who goes into Freemasonry thinking that they're going to gain some sort of benefit by membership probably going to be mistaken.
Oh,
In
okay.
fact, they warn you, that this is to do good for others, not to do good for yourself.
Right.
I think that one of the greatest things that has helped me in this particular aspect is it has given me a glimpse into the world of what Joseph Smith's world was like. Masonry hasn't changed a great deal in its in all of its iterations. It hasn't changed some. It's modernized itself some, but it hasn't. The kind of the basic principles of it. What did Joseph Smith see? What did he do? The fact that the only office I ever held in a lodge was that of chaplain, which happens to be the same office that Joseph Smith had, uh, gives me the chance to sit in a Masonic lodge and see the world and see the things that he saw, that know that the exact same words coming out of people's mouths were probably the same words coming out of his brother's mouth or his contemporaries' mouths. That and so that's from a historian standpoint. That's a huge benefit. It's like being able to travel back in time you know, to actually take part in something that Joseph Smith would have known and seen and done.
And I also believe that it's there's also a ritual drama in Masonry, and it's about a biblical character, Hiram Abiff, and it's about
Hiram Abiff,
Solomon,
yes.
Solomon's temple.
The widow's son and the building the master mason of Solomon's temple.
Right,
It's a
right,
ritualized drama in which the initiate of Freemasonry takes upon himself the role of Hiram Abiff in this ritual drama, much the same way that in the Temple Endowment you take upon yourself the allegorical role of Adam or Eve.
right. Okay. So At some point,
Ours is a bit more dramatic.
yes. So at some point, obviously, Masonry gets its way to the United States. There's a lodge in Nauvoo, and in March 1842, Joseph Smith is initiated into Masonry. He advances to Master Mason, and then 7 weeks later, we have the Temple Endowment. What would you say are some ritualistic similarities between a Masonic ceremony and our Temple Endowment?
Okay, I want to make it clear first that Joseph Smith did not burst onto Masonry. His father was a Mason. His two older brothers were Masons.
Right,
He grew
Hiram.
up in a Masonic home. He was familiar with this institution from childhood, as was I. Um, so, but the way he became a Master Mason in Nauvoo was somewhat unusual. There is what I call the 21 landmarks of Freemasonry. They're kind of like the constitution of Freemasonry, if you will. One of those, the landmark that probably brought Joseph first towards Freemasonry, other than his family connection, would be the landmark that states that the scripture of the people is an essential, what's called furniture of the lodge. And furniture in this case means items, ritualistic items. Freemasonry in England and in America generally construe that to be the Holy Bible. In Islamic countries, it's the Quran. In Jewish areas of Jewish Freemasonry, it is the Torah. It is whatever the person or people think of as the book of Holy Writ. So you can well imagine that Joseph and his early followers would have latched onto this like nobody's business and say, here's somebody where we can put the Book of Mormon on the altar of the lodge and have it treated with equal gravitas as the Bible. And in fact, when I was made a Master Mason, they put the three standard works of Scripture, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and the
Because
Holy
that was
Bible.
your scripture.
Yeah, because those were my scriptures, and in fact, there were, growing up, there were several Latter-day Saint men in my home lodge. One of whom happened to be the state patriarch, but um, so that's really, I think that idea was what got Joseph, that and his connection to it, and many of the men of his community were. He became a Mason in another provision of the landmarks, which allows the Grand Master of a Grand Lodge to make a Mason upon sight.
Hmm.
Normally, when you do this, you go through a somewhat lengthy process of becoming you apply, you're approved, you go through the first degree, which is called an apprentice degree. You learn these things, you are tested, you recite a whole lot of stuff. You go on to the entered apprentice degree, you learn more stuff, you recite that back, and then you go to Master Mason, you learn you are called raised to the degree, which is in Masonry, literally lifting someone up off the ground.
So it was quite
And
unusual for Joseph to advance
so
within
he
a day or
skips
two to
all of
Master
that,
Mason.
and because Grandmaster Jonas, the first Jewish Grandmaster in America, interestingly enough, raises Joseph Smith to the degree of Master Mason by a virtue of his authority to make Masons upon sight. And it's very rare, and everybody kind of raises their eyebrows at it. I go, no, it's right there. It's in the Constitution. Grandmaster has that authority. He can choose to do that. And he generally does it for persons of great importance in the community, which Joseph Smith certainly qualified for. So he kind of skipped the two preliminary steps and went straight on into the ritual of the Master Mason degree.
Right.
And we don't see much of the earlier degree work in the Temple Endowment that was to come. We see really the Master Mason degree work as the kind of the source of this. And I want to make it clear, this is the basic fundamental principle of my whole thesis. Thankfully, one that the church seems to have kind of latched onto with those topics. I mean, they made the topic about polygamy, and I mean, one of them was about Freemasonry.
Hmm.
Virtually, they pare it back what I say. The Temple Endowment is two things. It is the ritual, and it's what the ritual teaches. In my thesis, it was called The Message and the Messenger.
Mm.
The endowment's the message, the ritual's the messenger. The message doesn't change, the messenger does. Joseph Smith took what he knew his followers already understood because many of them were already Masons, and now he was too. And he took that as a template to teach this concept, partly, I believe, because they already knew the ritual part. They had already been exposed to it and were familiar with it. They would focus on what was being taught and not how it was being taught to them.
Right. So you see the ritual of the temple endowment utilizing and borrowing from the ritual of Freemasonry as this presentation method, but that the message or the doctrine, the covenants, the endowment of power, that is really the what the real endowment is, inspired revelation from God, but that Masonry is like this presentation device to
Yeah, it's
display it.
it's a ritualistic presentation device. If
Because
it
there's
happens to
some.
be a particularly good one, it works really well. But we should never confuse the presentation with the endowment, and the temple endowment itself makes that clear.
Mhm.
The presentation is not the endowment.
Right. Um, so maybe we could talk a little about some of the specifics. So some of the like similarities I'm thinking off the top of my head are there's also a ritual drama in the temple about the
Yes, there is.
creation and Adam and Eve. So it's a different creation drama. There's grips, ceremonial hand clasps. There's signs that are made. There were embraces of the 5 points of fellowship, which was taken away, and penalties, which are very similar, if not identical, to things that were in masonry. Some of the symbols, as far as like the wearing of an apron, those would be things which seem to be either borrowed or influenced, very similar to what he was exposed to in
Yeah,
masonry.
yeah, they certainly were. We masonry's most prominent symbol is the square and compass.
Hmm.
Where lots of Freemasons do. They have done rings, they have done jewelry of various. And the temple uses the idea of the square and the compass, um, meaning almost exactly the same thing. These are tools of a operative stonemason, and in fact, we talk about the compass as inscribing all truth into one great whole. Both ceremonies use
Hmm.
the same kind of verbiage. Um, the grips are pretty much the same. The meanings of the grips are different, obviously, because Freemasonry isn't a religion. It doesn't apply any kind of Christian iconography to the grips at all. Um, Freemasonry men teaches men's relationship with their fellow man. The Temple Endowment teaches man's relationship with deity. they're kind of different things. So we have the idea of the ritual drama. In the case of the Temple Endowment, it's Adam and Eve. In the case of the Masonic rituals, it's Hiram Abiff, his murder, and it's relatively complex. A lot more involved. A ritual in which the participant is a central part of the ritual and a
Hmm.
central part in telling the story. Um, but we have there are 101 little things like tapping. You go to the veil of the temple and they tap with the mallet, tap
Right.
3 times. That whole business of tapping um, comes in play in masonry, where you know, they, the initiate is brought to the door of the lodge. They tap 3 times, and the master of the lodge says, no, the doorkeeper says, "What is wanted?" Um, says, "Master, there's an alarm at the door," and the master says, "Attend to the alarm and see what is wanted." And then they open the door and they do this little exchange and they come back and they say, "So and so, having been approved, has now desires to enter the lodge." So we have that sort of exchange. The big thing that's the similar is it's the idea of using a ritualistic drama, and it's the idea, and we used to see it a lot more in the Temple Endowment than we do today. It used to be that there was all this exchange back and forth. Uh, you know, Elohim would tell Jehovah to tell Peter, James, and John to go down, and then they would reverse back through the whole thing saying the same thing.
Yeah.
We don't see that much anymore. We don't see it at all because
It's very
unless
repetitive.
somebody's doing a live endowment someplace that I'm unaware of, they're probably not. But masonry, that goes on all the time. That whole business of, you know, the the master of the brother senior warden are all assembled master masons, and the senior warden will, you know, say they are, and then the master of the lodge will say, "Inform the title I'm about to open this lodge of master masons on the third degree," and then they'll do this thing, and they'll go back and forth and back and forth. By the way, the tiler who stands outside the door with a drawn sword, the tiler of the Nauvoo Lodge was Olin Porter Rockwell, the
Okay.
famous American gunslinger.
Hmm. Wow.
And I would not want to meet up with him with a drawn sword.
Oh.
But we have the same thing because we have that idea of the recommend disc. And the recommend disc is in effect the tiler of the temple.
Hmm.
He performs the same fundamental function.
Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of ritual similarities and borrowing and influence from masonry in the temple
Yeah,
endowment. Now,
it's the
many.
style of it, it's the style of education. It's the method by which it's
Mhm.
the messenger. It's not the message.
So one question is: so many early Latter-day Saints who were both Masons and who first received the endowment from Joseph Smith. There's quotes from people like Heber C. Kimball or like Franklin Richards or others who claim that Joseph Smith said that Masonry, goes back to antiquity, and it's the Masonry we have today is some corrupted, degenerated form, perhaps of an ancient endowment or some sort of priesthood ordinances in the past. And just as Joe Smith was restoring ancient Christianity as part of the restoration, that he's restoring or repurposing some of the rites and the symbols of masonry back to their ancient form in ancient rites. Now, scholarship seems to say that masonry originated in medieval Europe, sometime in the 14th, 15th century. It doesn't go back to Solomon's temple, which was the
Earlier than that, but no.
earlier than that.
Yeah, yeah.
Doesn't seem to go back to Solomon's temple,
But it doesn't go
which
back
is
to Solomon's temple, no.
right.
But the reason that, and I've heard Freemasons, modern Freemasons, say the same idea because they've got the whole story of Solomon's temple and the building and the Hiram Abiff. That whole story is kind of built into it. And I've heard modern Freemasons make the assertion that this was some sort of ritual from antiquity dating back to the actual building of Solomon's temple.
Hmm.
Um, no reputable historian, Masonic or otherwise, would acknowledge that to be the case. There is nothing in the Bible that suggests that any such. We know what happened in Solomon's temple. It was the ritualistic slaughter of animals and similitude of what we believe to be the eventual sacrifice of Christ.
Right. There's
Okay.
not evidence of Masonic rituals occurring in Solomon's temple.
Yeah, evidence. There's no evidence to tie that. There's no evidence to tie masonry to the to antiquity in that way. And I would maintain there's, other than these musings by Heber Kimball and people who were really parroting what they heard from Masons anyway at the time. The Masonry, earlier periods of Masonry widely held that to be the case, even though there wasn't any historical substance to make that claim. So what they're doing is they're taking a Masonic claim and then laying Joseph on top of it. I would note that Joseph himself, we have no direct quotes from Joseph saying that. We only have second and third hand accounts of him saying that. Historians don't like that.
What's your thoughts? I have this quote from it's from the History of the Church, written May 4th, 1842. Now, I know Joseph often had scribes writing
Yeah.
for him, but it says here, maybe I could read it or share the screen if you want to see the quotes. Let
Well,
me.
that's okay.
Okay, I'll just read it to you. It says, I spent the day in the upper part of the store. So this is May 4th, 1842, when he introduces the endowment, in council with General James Adams of Springfield, Hiram Smith, Bishops Newell K. Whitney, George Miller, President Brigham Young, and Elders Heber C. Kimball and Willard Richards, instructing them in the principles and order of the priesthood, attending to washings, anointings, endowments, and the communication of keys pertaining to the Aaronic priesthood, and so on to the highest order of the Melchizedek priesthood, setting forth the order pertaining to the Ancient of Days and all those plans and principles by which anyone is enabled to secure the fullness of those blessings which have been prepared for the church of the firstborn and come up and abide in the presence of Elohim in the eternal worlds. In this council was instituted the ancient order of things for the first time in these last days. And someone might read that quote coming from, Joseph Smith's history, May 4th, 1842, that it seems that Joseph Smith believed that he's restoring sort of like this ancient order. With the
I'm sure he is. I'm sure I'm sure that because the message he's restoring.
Mhm. So you see the message, like the doctrine, the principles,
Yeah.
the covenants,
The
that is
covenants,
ancient.
all those, I draw a bright line between the message and the messenger, because otherwise we would not be justified in constantly, and we do it constantly all the time, be tweaking the ritual of the endowment, even the very words of the endowment. We are constantly making that
So you're
more
saying that if
meaningful to
this was an
modern
ancient
audiences.
restoration of a ancient ritual, that you think it would be problematic if there were tweaks and changes
Yeah, we
to
start
it.
going around saying this is ancient and revelatory ritual, um, that then we turn around and say, well, yeah, and we're gonna, you know, we've made changes. We've made changes to frankly, good changes. I mean, they've been good changes. They've been involving the sisters more in it and having them have a more of a central role in it. These are good things. These aren't bad things, but otherwise you're going to lock down. Are we going to practice there's only one group of Latter-day Saints that I am aware of that practices the original Nauvoo endowment, and they're nearly extinct. So, uh, uh, um, you know, you don't want to take the church and pickle it, like, and never ever, never be able to change it, never be able to have it meet modern needs of modern people in modern times. I think that's what Joseph was intending.
Mm.
And if you believe in continuing revelation, that wouldn't be something we would ever do.
So what do you think about those people who might be, you know, concerned and argue that if Joseph and the early Latter-day Saints that received the Temple Endowment sort of claim that this is, say, a restoring of an ancient ritual, so Masonry, this corrupted, degenerated uh, form of something in antiquity, but that if scholarship shows it's modern, doesn't this also show that the endowment is modern as well? Like, oh, Masonry's been proven to be modern, not go back anciently, so therefore the endowment is modern and not a restoration of an ancient ceremony.
I don't believe that the endowment, which is the message. What is it? It is a set of commitments to to do well, to be faithful, to be morally upright. I don't want to get involved in quoting the endowment
Or like the
word for
specific
word,
covenants.
but the specific covenants, you, of course, those are ancient. We can find those covenants in the Bible. We can find those covenants in other holy writ from other religious traditions, from Islam, from Judaism, from, even the Eastern religions. These are ancient ideas of how people should behave and how they should conduct themselves. Um, that's antiquity. How we teach it to people, the methodology we use, the wording we use, and what we do is a product of the time in which those ancient principles are taught to us.
Mm-hmm. I remember reading through Matthew Brown's book, Mormons and Masons, because
I'm
as you said,
not
there's
not a
no.
fan, but
Okay, well, I'd like to get
yeah,
your thoughts on this then, because as we talked about, scholarship can't see a direct line from Solomon's Temple to Masonry, and in his book, he there's a section where he talked about that some ritual elements or symbols in Masonry that some scholars have pointed to there being some similarities in some early Christian rites or iconography or some monastic orders, claiming that maybe this didn't go back to Solomon's Temple, but maybe some of these ritual elements or some of these symbols of Masonry might have been passed down from Christianity, but maybe we can't find the direct line of how that was done.
yeah.
What's your
We
thoughts on that?
well, I think there are some things, the symbol iconography of Freemasonry, which is clearly
Because
dates
the compass in the
into
square goes back
antiquity. The compass
centuries.
and the square goes back, and you can find reference of it into the Bible. So when the Freemasons are kind of forming up and developing this idea of speculative masonry, they're going to, they use and the compass and square were common tools. So they were, it's not that masonry didn't evolve full flower out of nothing either. You know, it
Sure. Had to come from
and
somewhere.
so but I think people turn themselves into a pretzel when they take this one little tiny thread and try to fish it back through and say, "Oh, we have this endowment ceremony all the way back to the Temple of Solomon." Um, and the endowment ceremony is clearly intended for a modern audience. We make covenants to, the covenant of well, what would have been what they would have not called the uh, um, United Order covenants, the communal aspect of it. Although communitarianism was found in the Bible, there's a reference in the New Testament to it. And communitarianism has nothing to do, Freemasons do not take any idea of communitarianism. This is something that's found in some areas of Christianity and in the Latter-day Saint experience. But you can do that with anything. You can you can string a wire back to almost anything if you want to. But what I'm looking for, and what I think most historians would be looking for, is a consistent proof of a endowment like ritual practiced in antiquity. And there is no evidence to that. And I don't believe the endowment wording itself would suggest such.
Mm. So yeah, so you're saying that we've not found in antiquity um, a ancient endowment ceremony that we looks very similar to the one that Joseph Smith
Yeah.
restored. What's your thoughts on? I've had on. I don't know if you're familiar with Jeff Bradshaw's work. I done some episodes with Jeff Bradshaw, and I've also explored a little bit in this topic that some people have found connections, or you might say parallels, to some ancient temple rites or ceremonial connections to, say, priestly initiation ceremonies, which you could say Drew Smith was influenced from in his translation of
Yeah.
the Bible, certainly for the initiatories. But even like, say, some coronation ceremonies of kings or queens in
Yeah.
ancient Israel, or some early Christian rites and Gnostic texts. And some people say that we can maybe see some resemblances to some ritual elements in the endowment
You,
scattered in the
you,
ancient world, and perhaps this could have either disseminated from something ancient, or that some of the things that Joseph seems to be repurposing for Masonry has some connections to things in the antiquity.
probably, I would say the latter of those two, that, he may have taken some elements of, you know, the, and, the coronation of King Charles,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Which I missed,
which,
by the way.
which you missed,
I didn't actually see
but,
the actual coronation, but I read about it.
you can go and look at that and you can see, there's just loads and loads and loads of kind of ancient symbolism, ancient practice, the anointing
Yeah.
um, of the king, and anointing it. This is not, again, we don't anoint in the Masonic rituals, but there are ancient practices that have come down through millennia of time, and that we still do. We still feel that's important. And obviously, they feel that important. They would, you know, I mean, it's a major part of the coronation of at least, Northern European monarchies. So,
And I believe the washing and anointing was introduced by Joseph Smith in 1836 at the
yeah,
Kirtland
yeah,
Temple.
that actually predates the endowment,
Yeah.
and,
So,
that this it was in the Kirtland Temple, and there is the third largest of the Restorationist faith still practices is it in public.
mm,
Uh,
okay. So let me think about what I'm going to ask you next, because I think I already know what your answer is. So you obviously hold more of the view, because the church has an essay on their website that I've used in part, and there's sort of like two different interpretations one can take on the similarities between the endowment ceremony and Masonry. It's undisputed that it was a catalyst and an influence, and some take the view, which I believe is more yourself, that it was really used as the presentation method. The rituals are similar, and okay, Masonry doesn't go back anciently, but distinguishing between the endowments and the presentation, the endowment is those specific covenants and the doctrine, and us being endowed with power and exalted to return back to the presence of God, becoming kings and priests, queens and priestesses
Yeah,
unto God. The presentation, okay, that has similarities to Masonry, and then there's some others who take a view that they see maybe connections in antiquity, or that some of those things, that some of those Masonic elements aren't just exclusive to Masonic ceremony, and maybe there could have been some sort of ancient ceremony. I'm guessing you lean more with the prior theory.
I reasonable with the price. In fact, that is before I'm 20 some odd years ago, before I first proffered this idea of separating the two. Most people would have never, if they had written that 20, 25 years ago, they never would have brought up the idea of what of the message and the messenger. That would have never crossed their mind. I
In the church
was
essay.
Yeah, I was going to say, and they spoke to me, but because I didn't get, they didn't credit me or anything, but they did call me up and ask me about, essentially what I'm telling you. Um, and I think that's the most, I can't remember what it's called, but there's a thing where if you have all the explanations, the simplest one is the best one, is the most likely to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would maintain that the ritualistic, many of the ritual, not all of them, obviously, we don't have a true order of prayer in Masonry. We don't have Washington anointings in Masonry. We don't have, and everybody likes to focus on the similarities, and nobody wants to ever talk about the
And
differences.
the differences are important as well, because my understanding is as well, like you receive a new name in Masonry, but isn't it like the name of a virtue? Whereas the new name that
Yeah,
we receive, it's a premortal name, and as well the compass and the square. I believe that they're pressed up against your chest,
yeah.
whereas.
Whether they use them, they will take literal compasses.
Mhm.
And by the way, a compass in this case is the thing that draws circles. Okay,
Yes,
not the thing that points direction.
right, yes, yeah, yeah,
Just to be
just so
clear,
people know.
but they will take that, they will press it against you, and they will say this is, to the flesh, this is an instrument of torture, but then they'll give you the moral lessons. I'd have to look it up. I don't, carry it around in my head, all that sort of stuff. So each of the tools has its practical application and its moral application.
Mhm.
So, um, the one I like, and I've used it in church talks, and nobody ever knows that I got it where I got it from, is the the 24-inch gauge. And anciently, the 24-inch gauge, this is right from the ritual, was used for masons to lay out their work. But we, as free and accepted masons, find a more noble purpose for it in the perfect division of a day. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours of service to your fellow man. So each of the tools has this moralistic thing. We do the same thing in the few tools that we use. We don't really use many. We use the compass and the square primarily in the temple endowment. We use it in the same way that truth is circumscribed into a whole. And you'll see that on decorations of temples occasionally. They'll have this point and then a circle around it. And that's where that comes from. Um, and the square to square our actions with the
Mm.
God's expectation.
So
And in
I'm
both of those cases, it's the same meaning.
right. I want to ask you one last question, because I'm currently sort of doing a little bit of research on this, and I've been sort of looking into what Jack Bradshaw and Matthew Brown have to say. Um, so they've pointed to some, we kind of already got your thoughts on this, but some connections, not so much to Solomon's temple, but some early Christian sort of rites or some texts that have some things which sound quite similar to some things in our endowment, like prayer circles, for example, or washings and anointings, or doing some sort of ceremony which is similar to like kings and priests in ancient ritual, almost insinuating that perhaps there could have been either introduced by Jesus or early disciples some sort of a ancient ritual, not necessarily identical to the one we have, but having some similarities to it. And that's something that I want to dive deeper into, explore that. But have you explored that? Do you have
I haven't
any thoughts on
explored it
that?
partly because we don't do Washington anointings. My focus has been where the temple and Freemasonry
Mm,
uh, come
that's your
together
specialty.
or go apart. I haven't spent a lot of time. I know that Washington anointings are very ancient, and we see it in things like, you know, coronation rituals.
Priestly
Um,
initiations.
Prayer circles. I think they're probably pretty obvious because they are found across humanity. This is not, something that Christians would have thought of. This is something that is everywhere in the human experience. So,
So I want to get your
so
thoughts on.
I guess when it's everywhere in the human experience, to expect Christ not to have encountered it seems pretty unrealistic.
Okay, so you don't think it's a super unique or strong element?
Yeah, I'm sort of viewing it as a natural course of human behavior.
So a critic or a naturalistic theory for the endowment, somebody might say that Joseph Smith could have drew upon the Bible when he was translating the Bible, coming
Which he
across.
probably did, yeah.
Yeah, which we would agree
Yeah,
he did,
yeah,
for
yeah.
the washing and anointing. His own revelations and Genesis and the Book of Moses sort of can account for, shall we say, the narrative, and maybe even account for some ideas where he could have got some of the covenants from. And then Masonry makes up the ritual elements, and then combine those three sources. That sort of can explain naturalistically the temple endowment, and you don't need to say that there was some supernatural element or any ancient element, and that you're differentiating between the endowment and the presentation out of necessity because scholarship doesn't support an ancient endowment ritual. I guess, what would you say in response to that? Why aren't you
I,
convinced with
I am
that
I am
naturalistic theory?
I am perfectly content and I do not expect Joseph Smith to be a human fax machine, which is what some people would want to make it. They want to say that he sat up there on the top floor of his store and took down dictation. Say this, do this at this point, this way. If that were the case, we would have no justification in our constant improvement and modification of the temple endowment and its ritual. If it really were a case, um, it's
That it came like
there's
perfect, like
perfect
from
in
God.
perfect in its inception. Why wasn't it written down? Why was, I mean, this it just I think a perfect we we get truth from many sources. We don't get truth from one source. We get truth from lots of sources. And if we have a naturalistic explanation for how we get truth, well, so be it. It doesn't have to be all at once. And frankly, the temple endowment never was. It used to take all day
Right.
to do it. I mean, um, it used to be that you could have the Aaronic priesthood part, but not the Melchizedek, because it, the universal assumption of Melchizedek priesthood came along later. Uh, Aaronic priesthood wasn't always something we gave to 11 and 12-year-old boys. That's really an early 20th century thing that happened.
Mm,
So, a man might be a priest and all he got was the Aaronic priesthood part of the endowment. Then it stopped for him. Uh, and, you know, all sorts of, you know, used to be that that there wasn't a witness couple. It used to be everybody had to go. Well, you can imagine it would have taken you'd go once and you'd never go again because you wouldn't have the time to devote to it. And the idea that we would do temple endowment work for the deceased would not be practical.
mm.
Huh.
Okay. So I guess this probably lead on to probably the next question people have, and I think you seem to be acknowledging, and I think believers would acknowledge that Joseph Smith would have been influenced when he was translating the Bible. He would have been influenced by the Book of Moses as well, and he was influenced by Masonry, and you could either interpret that as he was inspired and this was coming line upon line, but I can certainly see that interpretation the critics have as I can understand if you want to go with that as a critical naturalistic explanation for the temple endowment, and believers you would see it as the covenants, the actual endowment with power, the teaching, the narrative being a restoration and being inspired of God. And I suppose there is faith. So leading to my next question, some people have had, and this is probably something that I've wrestled with, because whenever I went through the temple endowment, I would have had very literalistic and fundamentalist views that the temple endowment was restored from God, pure revelation, and then learning about that there's been things taken out of the endowment, there's been adjustments to the ceremony, clothing, garments, and even some specific things that people used to covenant to being adjusted or modified.
Or
So I'm thinking,
deleted.
how can we make sense of changing an ordinance revealed directly from God? Maybe could you share sort of like what your perspective is on that? How we can make sense of ongoing changes, things being taken away, or also sometimes things are added to the temple ceremony as well. If somebody's like, how can you change this if this came from God?
Because we're Latter-day Saints. And one of the fundamental principles of Latter-day Saints, regardless of their variety, is continuing revelation. The heavens are opened. They are not closed off. We do not believe that we have got all the information and all the knowledge and all of the presence that we need, and we need nothing more. We are a faith that believes that God still speaks to the affairs of men.
And in terms of because somebody might think like, okay, yeah, that makes sense for more to be revealed, further light and knowledge, but they might be confused about things that were maybe once in the endowment, and then those things being taken away, questioning,
Because
were they
because we're
inspired?
not we're not 19th century men anymore,
Hmm.
men and women. We are not products of the 19th century. We don't have those way of looking at things. People in the mid 19th century were accustomed to high ritual. They were accustomed to ritualistic presentations of things, which we hardly see any of that anymore. It's an interesting fact that the Latter-day Saints have in their church services very minimalistic church services. I mean, I often wonder what would have happened if Joseph Smith had been a Catholic or an Episcopalian. If our church services would
Would be
would
different.
today look would be very different than the kind of the low Protestant uh, form we have. And it's interesting that we have these two diametrically different worship environments. We have our Sunday services. They're very plain. The churches are very plain. We don't have a lot of internal decoration. Um, we don't use the cross much. Um, we used to use it more than we do now, but we're fairly restrained, I guess, in our Sunday services. And then people go off to the temple and they see a heavily ritual, or even today, even in the modern and much more simplified endowment that we have today, they see a high-end ritual performance. It's sort of, and I think it's a good thing because there are some people. My late wife was raised Catholic, and she always missed that majesty, that idea of going into a Catholic mass and you're just kind of like overwhelmed by the sheer power of the thing coming at you. And she liked the temple because she got to feel that again.
Participating
You
in this
know,
ceremony.
yeah, the ceremony, the whole ritualistic idea, you're changing clothes and you're going in and you're taking part in these things, and it's kind of mystical, and in the same way that the Eucharist in the Catholic faith is a mystical experience. That
Very,
sort of,
very different to Sunday church.
yeah, very different from Sunday church. So, we have these two parallels of worship, the Sunday worship and the temple worship. I think it's a good thing that we do have those to some degree, those two things. I think some of they peeled away a lot of the masonry. They peeled away the penalties. They peeled away the swearing eternal vengeance on Missourians, stuff like that, that probably wasn't very helpful to keeping the spirit. Um, but, so we change it, we make it meet a modern need. We're not 19th century people. We never will be again.
Right. There's going to be alterations and adaptations according to, you could say, further inspiration, but also present circumstances and the culture as well. It's
Yeah.
uh, it's not fixed. That there's this
The,
flexible approach, and
the,
as you say,
the,
it's more of the
te-
presentation rather than the endowment itself.
the temple ritual endowment is meant to serve us. We do not serve it.
Hmm. What do you mean by that? Because that seemed quite
I mean
profound.
that we don't that it is meant to serve, to instruct and to edify and to uh, enlighten the modern members as we exist today. We are not here to keep the temple as some sort of a museum piece.
Hmm.
You
I
know,
see.
like, we're going to it's like going to, I don't know, you probably have something equivalent in England. Colonial Williamsburg is, and I was thinking of here, you're going to go back, everybody dressed in these antique clothes, and they're talking to you like they would have in, colonial times and stuff like that.
Do you say rather than it's not so much preserving necessarily this ancient, unchanging ritual, but it's modern and dynamic and
Yes,
flexible?
yes, and it should be. It has to be. Um,
Okay.
lots and lots of faiths that arrived out of the Second Great Awakening in the Americas and at the time that the Latter-day Saints appeared have come and gone, at least in part because they could not adapt
Hmm.
over time, because they didn't have that idea of continuing revelation. They had no methodology to to adapt themselves. We, fortunately, and by inspiration and God's will, do have that methodology. We should be thankful we do.
Okay, so I think this has been a good discussion. I'd like to ask maybe just one final question. This is maybe getting more to maybe your own personal testimony and your experiences with the temple. But what are some things that you have found, either inspiring or beauty that you found participating in temple rituals and in the doctrine and you could say the covenants that Joseph restored? What spiritual value have you found participating in temple rituals?
Well, I like to think, because I'm a Mason, I have come at it with a unique experience. And I remember when I was first and when I was newly endowed, and I was a Mason before I was endowed. Um, I it, and that gave me a very different sense of the endowment. And I was not as overwhelmed by the endowment as perhaps somebody who comes into it would know. They come out of the LDS Sunday services and they suddenly dropped into the temple endowment. Um,
Like me, I
I,
was like, what on earth have I just done?
what have I just done? It's so different from anything I've ever experienced. I, I feel a kinship to Joseph and his contemporaries when I'm in the temple. Partly because I see kind of how their mind was working and how they were trying to take these ideas and present them in a way that their contemporaries might understand it. Um, and I think that's for me at least that were very valuable. Um, and coming from someone who spent a lot of time thinking about history, got point A to point B. Um, I I enjoy the veil ceremony quite a bit. And it partly is because of the grips and because I knew the grips going in, for even though I knew them in a different context, I knew them. I could give them, which advantage because I'm not having to, you first time through, you're constantly, oh, I gotta remember everything. And it's like, you don't have to remember everything. And in fact, sometimes I still can't do things without the guy whispering in my ear. He to say, but um, I enjoy that idea, the idea of passing from one state to another. Um, moving in the Cardston, Alberta temple, which is a beautiful building.
Oh, I served my mission in Calgary, Canada, so I went to Carson a couple times.
Okay, well, Cardston's a beautiful building. It also happens to be the first prairie school architecture built in Canada. It's a national landmark there. And in the Carlton Temple, you go in and there's this idea of progression, and I really like that. Like you get it in the Masonic Lodge, but nowhere as near as vividly as you do. It's like particularly going into a place like Cardston, because if you recall, each of the endowment rooms in Cardston, the woodwork gets progressively nicer, I guess, as you work your way through. It's that idea, and in Cardston, you go up levels as you work around the rooms. You're constantly going up steps, up levels. It's a kind of an architectural metaphor for progression, which I find to be the idea of progression, being able that we are never, ever, ever trapped in one state, that we can always improve and be better and move on to that next eternal progression, a big eternal progression sort of fella. Um, Interestingly enough, I'm also a believer in eternal regression. I believe that people can advance and they can decline. And it's their agency to choose which direction they are going to go in. And I think that probably extends into our next life too. We always have agency. We're always able to choose good or bad or right or wrong.
Very good. Well, Greg Kearney, it's been really good having this discussion with you. I've really enjoyed the time and your perspective and insights. I'll recommend in the description, I'll put in the link to your fair presentation. And I think you've also been interviewed elsewhere as well for my listeners. And listeners who've been watching, if you've enjoyed this, give it a like, comment underneath your thoughts as well. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future interviews as well. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.